Hello, everyone. Today is Saturday, August 31st, 2019. I'm Bob Diebold, Vice Chairman of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. Today, we continue with Phase 4 and the 21st webinar in our series of webinars on the topic, Comparing and Contrasting the True Teachings of Jesus with the Traditional Tenets and Practices of Organized Institutional Christianity. This is topic 8 in the study guide called Revelation Revealed. Neil Waldrop is the author and the chairman of the committee. I am turning this webinar over to him now. Neil, over to you.
Thank you very much, Bob. I am once again delighted to be with you and with our other participants for this extremely interesting topic. In addition, I would say that it is a great satisfaction to me that we have now changed over to examining an essay that I wrote quite recently, completing it on the 24th of June, Living the Real Religion of Jesus. But for the purpose of viewers who may not have followed our series in the past, please allow me to state that the series in general is based on a comprehensive analytical document dating from 2016 called Revelation Revealed. And this document can be downloaded from the website of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. If you do not have it to hand already, I recommend that you do that. The website is as follows: www.globalendeavor.net. I say again, www.globalendeavor.net. The middle phrase, global endeavor, is treated as a single word without any space or punctuation in it. In addition, because of what we actually will be discussing today, I recommend that you also download the document, Living the Real Religion of Jesus, the essay that I wrote just recently. That essay is likewise available from the same website. I believe the link to it is 3 links above the link for Revelation Revealed. In addition, because those of you watching have no way of asking us a question during the time that we are conducting the webinar, we offer you the possibility of sending us a question by email in writing, or perhaps 2 or 3 questions if you wish. And this would ideally pertain to something that one of us says, or just an idea of yours that you happen to have while you are watching our webinar. If you wish to do that, the email address that you would use is listed at the bottom of the homepage of the website for the Committee of the Global Endeavor, the website that I identified before. And in specific terms, the email address is as follows: info@globalendeavor.net. If we decide to use your question in a future program, we reserve the right to edit the wording. And in that event, you will receive an answer from all participants who are panelists that day during our webinar, not just from me personally. So now, without further procedural remarks, I will turn to the subject that we will discuss, whereby we had just launched discussion of my new essay, Living the Real Religion of Jesus, in the concluding half hour or so of the program last week. And we had read the first 2 paragraphs on the first page and had left off immediately before the excerpt from paper 155, section 6, whereby Jesus is talking to the apostles, and the excerpt consists of 2 paragraphs from that section of paper 155. Marvin, would you read the excerpt that appears at the bottom of page 1 of the essay? You're muted, I'm sorry.
Good, be glad to, Neil. So as you mentioned, this is in the foundation text. It's page 1731, first couple of paragraphs in the 2-column text, the fellowship text. It's paper 155, section 6, paragraphs 3 and 4. Jesus speaking here. I have called upon you to be born again, to be born of the Spirit. I have called you out of the darkness of authority and the lethargy of tradition into the transcendent light of the realization of the possibility of making for yourselves the greatest discovery possible for the human soul to make. The supernal experience of finding God for yourself, in yourself, and of yourself. And of doing all this as a fact in your own personal experience. And so may you pass from death to life, from the authority of tradition to the experience of knowing God. Thus will you pass from darkness to light, from a racial faith inherited to a personal faith achieved by actual experience. And thereby will you progress from a theology of mind, handed down by your ancestors, to a true religion of spirit, which shall be built up in your souls as an eternal endowment. Your religion shall change from the mere intellectual belief in traditional authority to the actual experience of that living faith, which is able to grasp the reality of God and all that relates to the divine spirit of the Father. The religion of the mind ties you hopelessly to the past. The religion of the spirit consists in progressive revelation and ever beckons you on toward higher and holier achievements in spiritual ideals and eternal realities.
Thank you, Marvin. I would like to address a very general question before we go into the specific wording of these two paragraphs. Jesus is speaking to the apostles, and the Midweyer Commission has recorded this. Are his remarks exclusively directed to the apostles, or are these remarks of Jesus also directed to us? Approximately 2,000 years later. Bob, would you take a look at that question, please?
Sure, Neil, thanks. I'll be brief because I think that the answer is absolutely no. It's not just to the apostles, and yes, it's to all humans who will have a chance to be able to either read these words or in some other form and fashion and see them. There is someplace in the papers that says that this bestowal, Jesus's or Michael's seventh bestowal as Jesus of Nazareth, was for all the worlds, many worlds to see. So, don't know exactly, what the practical implications or the process by which that would happen, but certainly there were more minds and ears that were not only hearing it in real time, I suspect, but will also hear and see these things as time goes forward, at least on your ranch for sure, and if not in other places. Over.
Thank you. Doreen, do you agree that these requests from Jesus's part are directed to us as well as to the apostles?
Oh, of course, without a doubt. Everything that is put into the Rancher book is meant for us and to have a greater understanding. It's not there just, why would they go to all this trouble of giving us the spirit of the Trinity, each of them, if it was just meant for just certain people? It almost reminds me of when they talked about the Hebrews, and it wasn't just for the Hebrews when they spoke, but they did misinterpret, thinking that, oh yes, when God gave to Moses or Abraham the directives, it was just for those people. But of course, it's never. God is not discriminating. He doesn't, he loves, how do you ever think that anyone would put in information into this revelation being exclusive just for certain people? It wouldn't follow suit for the rest of the revelation. Anyway.
Thank you, Doreen. Based on the answers that Bob and Doreen have given, I'd now like to draw the conclusion and ask Marvin to react to it. Based on what Bob and Doreen have replied, it is logical to infer that this first sentence of Jesus' statement, "I have called upon you to be born again, to be born of the Spirit," is addressed to us. Yes? Do you agree?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think to every mortal being in the entire universe, local universe of Neverdon, Jesus is basically saying, the opportunity you have to move from a religion that is simply a conceptual religion, a religion of the mind, where you just understand certain ideas and they are sort of removed and you're not really engaged with them, to move from that level of understanding to the level of actual living relationship with God's presence within, where you love and are loved and you know God and God knows you and you share your inner life with God, to move into that dynamic, vivid experience of live relationship with God and with each other as sisters and brothers in spiritual family. He's offering that opportunity to every mortal being in his local universe, and which is, of course, the gift that the Father universally provides to every mortal in existence. So it's addressed to everybody, every person in the entire universe, really. It's appropriate.
Thank you. I would now like to delve into some of the specific words of these two paragraphs, or at least the first paragraph. In the second line of it, as printed on the page, we have the phrase, the darkness of authority and the lethargy of tradition. And then if we go down a few more lines, it states, and so may you pass from death to life, from the authority of tradition to the experience of knowing God. On the one hand, Jesus was talking about authority and tradition as applied to the apostles. But since there is a consensus, so far at least, that these words are addressed to us and to contemporaries living on Urantia, I wonder how we should interpret the phrase, the darkness of authority and the lethargy of tradition. Would you please take a look at those words, Stephen, and give me your interpretation, give us your interpretation?
Well, there's no doubt that tradition can be a drag on spiritual progress for the human race. That's one aspect of tradition. The book does go into detail about how tradition can also be supportive of the spiritual life of individuals and of religious groups. So Jesus has called people out of the darkness of authority. He has not condemned authority per se, nor has he condemned tradition per se. Any human activity can be positive or negative. The groups that support human civilization on this planet, we have the angels of the churches that are there to preserve the best of tradition and to support that tradition as we go forward in time. And there are the angels of progress that focus on moving into the future. These things are not contradictory, they are complementary. So to see tradition per se as an enemy is a big mistake. And if you interpret these phrases as condemning authority and tradition per se, I think you're making a big mistake.
Thank you. I believe that what you have just stated is an important element. I would interpret myself, Jesus's remarks, as in effect a paraphrase of his comment at the very end of the paragraph, whereby he says, quote, and thereby will you progress from a theology of mind handed down by your ancestors to a true religion of spirit, which shall be built up in your souls as an eternal endowment. Does that make sense to you, Bob?
Yes, it does, Neil. I, taking what Steve just said, that tradition is something not to be, I guess, feared or put down as something that it's not totally let's not do anything with tradition. I think is a point well taken. What I got out of this first paragraph, though, is that Jesus is being pretty strong in his statements. Even the one from death to life, and he's making these analogies. Going from the authority or the tradition of authority to transcendent light of possibility of progressing. I've said this before that if we look at the Master Seraphim, as Steve brought up, there are more groups out of the 12. I think it's either 10 that are all progressive type groups, but there is that little modicum of let's make sure that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I detected that that's something that we need to consider a little bit there. But I do believe that Jesus is putting some strong statements down for the apostles, and something that we need to consider in the light of what our current environment is, on the planet in this day and age. Back to you, Neil.
Thank you. Doreen, I'd like you to focus on aspects of the fourth and fifth lines, specifically the words, the supernal experience of finding God for yourself, in yourself, and of yourself, and of doing all this as a fact in your own personal experience. Excuse me. Now, in addition to the literal meaning of these words, I wonder if you could comment on whether this means that you are going to separate yourself from all other human beings, or whether you would look upon this statement of finding God for yourself as, by implication, including your relationship with other human beings.
Well, apparently, the book does say that everything, whether it's a belief system, whether it's the religion, it has to be socialized. If it isn't socialized, then it becomes fanaticism. But I mean, that whole paragraph for me was saying something that I cannot entirely identify or applicable to my own personal experience. For I never had to eliminate any kind of tradition. I was a clean slate. Then I found what I needed. And I would say that it was this influence, this childlike experience, the relationship that I created. It grew, as an invisible being in my life that I created in my mind. So there was never an intermediary. I had no influences. Again, being atheist household, I didn't know anything, and I wasn't interested in religion. It was nothing that ever entered my mind except for the fact that what happens when a child is desperate, you need to share your life with someone and something. And it was all about my inner life. And I truly existed until this day. I never shared my inner thoughts with anyone but the being I created. And of course, finding out that there is a God. So this inner life is the most powerful thing. And of course, that to me was more real than the outer life. So I could never understand why people needed someone to speak for them, to tell them about something that you could find on your own. And that's only because I didn't have the experience. But everything has a purpose. Every experience that people have in their communities and their religion, I know so many people, they love it and it's helpful and it's community and it helps them to live and associate. And whether, you could still find a personal relationship with God in spite of that. It just wasn't the route I took. That's all.
So if I understand, you in effect are telling us that the words, the darkness of authority, were not words that apply to you because you were not under anyone's spiritual or religious authority at the time, that the only darkness that may have affected you was when the lights went out in your bedroom.
No, no, no. It was the darkness of the home life that was dark. That's why, again, why does anyone search for light? Why do you need to have someone to indicate that you're a living human being? And that is absolutely the soul's call for help. And help, of course, once you open the door, help is there.
Thank you, Doreen. At this point, many people have put very interesting ideas on the table. Marvin, I wonder if there are elements of this or elements of your own that you'd like to comment on at this point.
Yeah, thank you, Neil. And to some extent, this is in response to the Jesus shared thoughts in the passage we read, and in the whole passage on true religion, the two passages, two discourses, and excuse me, but more particularly in relation to Stephen's comments. And Stephen and I think, share some affinity in trying to hold forth for the value of group religious function and religious institutions, and etc. Not unduly, but to recognize the contributions they make. And I'll simply make this point. In this business of moving from, let's say, a purely conceptual religion or religion of ideas or intellect, where you believe in God exists, but you don't have much interaction with God. It's not a live thing. It's just a set of intellectual or cognitive beliefs. And religions that promote that shallow engagement with the tradition or the doctrine. In the matter of that and the movement into living more dynamic interpersonal relationship with God and spiritual relationship with other human beings, there are two areas of focus that I think is helpful to look at. And both of them can toggle either way. So to be more specific, the actual decision to be engaged in personal spiritual experience is always the decision of the individual religionist. It's not done by a group, it's done by an individual. It's individual's volition or choice to move to that level of spiritual engagement where you're having a real encounter with God. And the distinction is, it's like I can think about the possibility of having a relationship with you, Neil. I can believe even in the possibility. But having that cognitive understanding in the possibility is not the same as my having a living relationship with you. That's a whole other level of the phenomenon, right? And that's my choice, to move from one level of engagement to the other. So it's always the responsibility of the individual to make the choice for personal spiritual experience versus the dead level of religious authority or simply intellectual cognitive ideas, right? Doctrines. At the same time, a religious tradition and the leadership of religious tradition can be attempting simply to establish and maintain their own authority or teach simply intellectual doctrine, or they can be actively engaged in the effort to introduce people and encourage people to move into living relationship and involvement with God. And that can be part of the tradition. It can be part of the tradition to have an emphasis on living spiritual experience. And to the extent that it functions that way, I think group religion functions well. So I think Jesus wasn't saying group religion is bad or institutional religion is bad. He was saying that institutional or group religion that stayed focused limitedly on intellect or on authority instead of living religion was not very helpful. It's counterproductive. But it's the group religious effort has that choice to move into that realm, and it's always ultimately the choice of the individual to either accept or move into that deeper realm. So I just make those points.
Thank you, Marvin. I believe that in effect, you've given us a way of understanding the phrase, the darkness of authority and the lethargy of tradition, which emphasizes perhaps insistence on particular teachings as a matter of compulsory doctrine, as opposed to group associations that could be understood as a kind of fellowship or cooperation for mutual edification, for mutual encouragement and inspiration. In this context, I would compare the underlying ideas that you have expressed with remarks by Melchizedek that appear in section 5 of paper 103, specifically in paragraph 12 of that section. It corresponds to the second paragraph on page 1135 of the single column edition. And the Melchizedek states, when a member of a social religious group has complied with the requirements of such a group, he should be encouraged to enjoy religious liberty in the full expression of his own personal interpretation of the truths of religious beliefs and the facts of religious experience. And then after two intervening sentences, the paragraph concludes with the following sentence: there is great hope for any church that worships the living God, validates the brotherhood of man, and dares to remove all creedal pressure from its members. Now, I would say that your comments, and I believe aspects of Stephen's comments, fit into this paradigm that the Melchizedek has supplied, namely full liberty of belief, while encouraging perhaps participation in a group that is very tolerant and open. Would you tend to agree with that interpretation that I've just given? Marvin?
Let me just defer. I think Stephen had his hand up and maybe he could speak. Yeah, and then I'll go ahead. Go ahead, Stephen. I'll comment further.
All right, Stephen, it's your turn because Marvin has yielded to you.
Okay. I just want to say that I agree with everything that Marvin said, but that's kind of assumed, I suppose. Yeah, as far as what you just read, Neil, yes, I'm in great sympathy with that. But there's a difference, I think, at least in principle, between creedal pressure or creedal enslavement with a creedal guidance. Okay, most people need some sort of guidance intellectually and spiritually, and they'll be the first to admit that. There are some people, like a lot of Urantia book readers, who feel they don't want anybody telling them anything about anything, that they can figure it out for themselves, and please don't tell me what to think. But they tend to be the exception. So I think it's conceivable anyway that there can be a group practice of religion where there are a body of shared beliefs, and that there are certain people who are better trained, better educated, who are able to explain those beliefs without necessarily instituting institutional authority to force people to believe one way or the other. I've told this story before, but in my denomination, the Episcopal denomination, when I was getting my preparation for baptism, that's exactly the kind of experience I had with the priest that I talked to. I said, well, I don't believe in the doctrine of the Virgin Mary. We talked about that. We decided to agree to disagree, and it was left at that. And he put out his opinion, I put out my opinion. Now, most of the church are not going to do that with a priest or a minister. They're going to say, okay, well, you know a lot more than I do. So, and I don't want to take the time and the energy to really investigate it. So for the time being, I'm going to accept your interpretation since I don't know any better. That is not uncommon, and it's not necessarily evil either. It allows people to function with some sort of sense of security in their religious and philosophical beliefs. It doesn't fit everybody, but it fits for a lot of people. So I'll just leave it at
that. Thank you. I think now I'm in the middle of a football metaphor. We might call it a double reverse, because I started with Marvin, who yielded to Stephen. on the understanding that he wanted the ball back after Stephen finished massaging it. And so now, Marvin, it's up to you again.
Okay. And then I will yield to Bob, is that okay, Bob?
That's certainly right. I noticed Bob's request for the floor too.
The Ranch book says something very interesting about leadership. It says substantially less than 1% of the human population are gifted leaders. And I think that's true for spiritual leadership as well as other forms of leadership. There's a role for leadership. There are people who are talented and called to provide leadership spiritually. And I think any group of people would be wise to find ways to discover that leadership talent and motivation and to equip it, help it sort of hone its abilities, and to give it sanctioned role and responsibility to provide that leadership talent. Jesus did that with his group of folks. He had people who moved through a training process to become apostles and to become teachers, and they went out and preached. So he had modes of establishing and developing leadership and giving it sanctioned role to function in leadership. And so any group function must have that in order to function effectively, is to resolve the issues around the development of good leadership and the elimination of bad leadership. So nothing Jesus says in this section, I think, should be understood to speak against the evolution of leadership in groups of people spiritually. So that's the key point I think I would want to add to the conversation. And then I think Bob, and then it looks like Stephen's got more thoughts. And, everyone's getting into the act now.
All right, go ahead. This is Alphonse and Gaston, Stephen and Marvin.
Listen, when you talk about leadership, you also talk about authority. And I hate to say that, but that authority wielded spiritually in a spiritually fragrant way, or it cannot be wielded in a spiritually fragrant way. But leadership implies authority.
All right, I'll wait till everyone else.
As a concept, Marvin, I have to give opportunities to others, in particular, requests from Bob and Doreen, and maybe we'll come around the bush again for your further comments.
Absolutely.
After they speak. Bob?
Yeah, Neil, it occurred to me as we were talking here that, this same theme of conserving versus progressing seems to, have to have some kind of a cosmic balancing act. The cosmos is going to progress. We've been, they tell us a number of times throughout the papers that Jesus's gospel will ultimately succeed. And there's it seems that this idea of tradition is something that the Spirit of Truth does not really support, but it does it in a way that it takes tradition and it moves it forward in a way that it meets the current environmental mandate. In paper 194, I'll just read the last sentence there, section 2, paragraph 1. It's about the bestowal of the Spirit of Truth. And this kind of, as we were talking, this is what kind of sprung from my mind here. And it's talking about where the midwayers are explaining to us exactly what is the Spirit of Truth. And now that he has personally, he being Jesus, Michael, has personally left the world, he sends in his place his Spirit of Truth, who is designed to live in man for each new generation to restate the Jesus message, so that every new group of mortals to appear upon the face of the earth shall have a new and up-to-date version of the gospel. Just such personal enlightenment and group guidance as will prove to be an effective solvent for man's ever new and varied spiritual difficulties. I think that the midwayers know that groups are not going to go away anytime soon, at least not in this dispensation of this revelation. So this idea of progress, to me, seems to be in a 70-30 realm, or even an 80-20 realm, probably even more, where the entire universe and everything that's directing us is to understand what the dynamics are of the current situation, current civilization, of current culture, and restate the message so that we can deal with it. Back over.
Thank you. Doreen, there is a rich realm of possibilities in front of you. If it is possible for you to compare or distinguish between the idea of leadership that Marvin talked about and the idea of creedal pressure that was a feature of the paragraph from paper, I believe, 103, the comments of Melchizedek that I read. I would hope you would comment on that, the difference between creedal pressure and leadership.
Honestly, I'm coming from a different place. I just don't see that as something that is going to lead me to learn to find God and to love him and to grow my soul towards God consciousness. No creedal pressure, no doctrines, none of this. Leadership, the only thing leadership could do is inspire you. And yes, I think that's fine. And I've been inspired many times by some people that understood and had depth of understanding. But to me, it's a whole different course that it speaks to me in a way that I have to develop my soul. The whole book is written to find God and to do his will and to become more godlike. I cannot do it through leadership, through any other person. I can, after I find God and grow in that understanding, then you socialize it, you could bring it out, and you could share your life with others, because that relationship is so vast and extraordinary because it changes you. And otherwise, how can anybody change? It's like, how can I fall in love with someone without really getting to know them and understand them? And no outside person could do that. I could share my life with others. But I found in this whole idea of the organizations and the people we meet, I have found, I don't remember ever anyone sharing their spiritual life and really talking about how they found God and what it has transformed them or anything like that. Neither do they talk about a priest or a rabbi or anyone that has influenced their life in that way. Because tradition is tradition. It's just rote and what you're accustomed to and habit forming. And I think that's wonderful if it serves you to move forward. But some people are stuck. And I've met many people that sadly enough are stuck and waiting for that message to enliven them and be born again. And that's individual. And to be born again is a whole other route that I would talk about. But nevertheless, I don't want to prolong anything because I know other people want to speak. Thank you for hearing me.
I first want to thank you for your remarks, but I also would like to express a hope that you will not treat your remarks as in any sense an interruption. They are very valuable. They're not really detracting from anyone else's opportunity to speak. And so please acquire a degree of self-confidence that we are listening to you and that you have every right to express your own views, that we welcome these views and we indeed cherish them. I would like to turn to the final sentence in the second paragraph, and I will read it for the sake of allowing the issues to be clearer. It reads as follows: "The religion of the mind ties you hopelessly to the past. The religion of the spirit consists in progressive revelation and ever beckons you on toward higher and holier achievements in spiritual ideals and eternal realities." So what I would like to focus on is this opposition, or perhaps I should say this contrast between the religion of the mind, the phrase that Jesus starts the sentence with, and the religion of the spirit, which is the phrase at the beginning of the second half of the sentence after the semicolon. Bob, could you distinguish these two for us, please, or at least comment on how they differ?
Well, the way I see this is with mind being three levels, of course. Is the papers really spend quite a bit of time about the superconscious, and the superconscious being the area where our thought adjuster actually spiritizes our thoughts and moves them, building our soul, building the threads of our soul. Where the conscious mind is that part that I have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, and I'll leave the subconscious out. So the subconscious, conscious, and superconscious, I'll deal with just the conscious and the superconscious in relation to your question here. The religion of the mind operates in the conscious area, and it's pretty much stuck, I think, in current present time frames. It's a matter of moving the time units to be a little bit larger. As humans grow and mature, their time units get larger. If you see a child, they have the shortest time unit. If you have a grandchild who's 2 years old and a grandparent who's 72, their time units are exactly opposite, which is why the energy draining from the grandparents, is just a natural occurrence. So that's the religion of the mind. I see that as operating in the conscious only, but the religion of the spirit has to operate, and our thought adjuster only operates where those value-driven thoughts that move from the conscious into the superconscious is where our soul is being built. And that's the process that I see going on, and that's the dichotomy, I think. I'm not sure exactly what you called it, but the contrast, I think, is what you called it, between those two. Over.
That's fine. Stephen, would you comment on the distinction that Jesus is making between the religion of the mind and the religion of the spirit?
Yeah, the religion of the mind seems to be defined in that very first sentence. It's defined as mere intellectual belief in traditional authority, which I would agree with. But you can have mere intellectual belief in non-traditional authority. You can have mere intellectual belief in revelation. You can have mere intellectual belief in authentic revelation, like the Urantia book. You can have mere intellectual belief in anything. So that, I think, is what they mean by the religion of the mind. And in this case, they relate it to traditional authority. That's valid as far as it goes. But the problem here is not traditional authority, it's mere intellectual belief.
If I understood your comment, and please correct me if I'm not correct in interpreting this, you're distinguishing between intellectual belief and spiritual experience. Is that a fair conclusion?
Yes, and that distinction can take place in any context, whether it's essentially traditional or essentially non-traditional. That's a contrast that takes place as a part of human religious experience and is not confined to any one kind of social context or another.
Thank you, Marvin. I think I saw your finger at a recent moment asking for the floor yet again. Am I correct?
Yes, you are.
All right, then please go ahead.
My comments are related to your immediate question and that last sentence in the passage, as well as the ongoing. So I want to draw a connection back to the question of institutions and leadership and the role that they play. And I'll make, but the first observation is around that last sentence, and I'll just read it again. I'll simply say that last sentence, I think, relates to a distinction between something that is past and static or non-growing, right? It's sort of inert, and something, a spiritual experience that is future-oriented. In other words, it's the unfolding of potentials into new realities. And relationships between ourselves and God and with each other are always new and evolving unfolding realities where growth is involved, right? So the sentence reads, the religion of the mind ties you hopelessly to the past. In other words, it's what's been accomplished. The religion of the spirit consists in progressive revelation. It's an unfolding reality and ever beckons you on toward higher and holier achievements in spiritual ideals and eternal realities. And what Jesus is saying is that ideally, you will always be active and growing and progressive, forward moving in your spiritual life, because these are living relationships. So I just wanted, that to me is the key point here in that last sentence and in this whole section. And then how it relates to leadership in institutions. One of the most interesting things that I ran across, and I ran across it some 20, 30 years ago, and it's always stuck with me, about the nature of leadership. The term, I'm a student of social sciences, right? So psychology primarily, but sociology and social psychology have also been areas of study, and history. The history and dynamics or sociology of religious function has been an area of study for me. Went back to seminary for a couple of years and studied history and sociology of religion. One of the things I discovered back then in the 1980s is that the founder of modern sociology, a gentleman named Emil Durkheim, he wrote an interesting text. He wrote many books. One of the books he wrote was entitled Charisma. And he coined the term charisma. I think it's probably a Latin term from charism, which I don't know exactly what it means. But he wrote this book, Charisma, and it set the stage for all of our ongoing studies on the nature of what's called charismatic leadership. And he made it very, his central, I'm sorry?
Charis means grace.
Charis, no, I'm thinking
Is grace in Greek.
Charis.
The word charisma or charismatic ultimately derives from Greek. It passed through Latin also.
Mm-hmm. I thought the Latin form was charism, charism, actually. But in any case, his term was charisma, and he created brand new theory around the term, but it's become foundational in sociology in terms of the nature of leadership, and especially what he called charismatic leadership. And it's fascinating. His primary premise was this, that a charismatic leader is someone who gives voice or expression to the needs of a group of people. So it's actually a compact or a contract of sorts between a group of people who have a set of yearnings or needs that have been unexpressed or unfulfilled. And along comes a leader who gives effective expression to those things that the group wants expressed or fulfilled. And it's sort of a partnership between a charismatic leader and a group of people that will follow that charismatic leader. Now, before you go thinking that that's an aberrant phenomena of some kind, he didn't think of it as he thought of it as foundational in terms of the nature of leadership. I'll give you a good example. This endeavor we're engaged in, you are our leader, Neil. And in a sense, you are a charismatic leader. You have an idea, you have a sense of impelling. All of us involved in this endeavor have a common desire to participate in this group function. And you are providing the charismatic leadership for this group. Now, that's not a bad thing. That's just a natural phenomenon. It happens all the time in group function, right? So when you think about institutions and good leadership really helps individuals to move from the past into the future of their spiritual desires, right? And it helps give expression to a pathway that helps people to move forward in living personal spiritual experience. That's my best understanding of effective spiritual leadership. And it's a legitimate and absolutely necessary function. And good group religious dynamics establishes talented leaders, people who want to be at the service of the needs of the group, and gives them sanction, gives them role and even authority to function effectively as leaders, and allows the fulfillment of the contract between the needs of the group and the needs of the individual to move the group forward, to move individuals within the group forward. So in that sense, Jesus was essentially a profound charismatic leader for his people and for us. So there's nothing wrong with it. It's absolutely foundational.
I would have to give some personal reactions to what you just said before I indeed yield to Stephen. As far as I can remember, this is the first time that anyone has called me charismatic. And I suppose I should welcome that as a comment. I believe you intended it as a favorable reference.
Absolutely.
I would say that in the case of my role as the leader of these webinars, first, it's a fact. But beyond that, there is an aspect of this leadership role that I'm fulfilling that is perhaps a contrast with the leadership roles that others assume in other contexts. And that is the fact that there is no authority. I am not telling you what to say. I am not telling any of you what you should believe. I am certainly welcoming logical comments from time to time that criticize me or my views or something I have written. This is all part of the context of the webinar, wherein my function, if you wish, as the leader of the webinar, is essentially to facilitate broad discussion. And so in this context, we have separated the function of leadership from the function of authority to insist upon or foster conformity. And it is, excuse me, Marvin, thank you. I'll go back to you in just a minute. That authority to foster or insist upon conformity is unfortunately part of the religious tradition that the Christian movement inherited from the Roman Empire. We've discussed that. So yes, leadership can function without authority pursuing conformity, but that's an important difference. And now I have requests from Stephen and Bob, but I will yield to you briefly.
Yeah, just very briefly, the authority always flows from the group. The reason that you can function in the leadership role that you are in, including all of what you just described, is because we wish to participate with you in that kind of endeavor, and we give you the authority to function in the role that you are functioning in, including everything that you described. The same is true for any religious group. They sanction leadership to take them where they would like to go because that leadership can effectively do so. That's what happened with the followers of Jesus. They yearned for spiritual growth and development. They trusted him to provide that leadership, and they sanctioned his leadership and followed him. That's just the nature sociologically of leadership and group authorization of that leadership in whatever form it takes, whether it's your form of leadership or the papal form of leadership. It always flows from the desire of a group of people who will follow.
I think it would be interesting if we were going to pursue this academically, but we will not. I would say that there is a functional difference between authority that is basically consensual, which is what you just described, and authority that at least claims to have a mandatory character. And this mandatory character is in effect the idea of authority compelling someone to do something or to follow certain instructions, to accept certain teachings. That's fundamentally different. When people have joined together voluntarily and are participating in some group activity as a matter of their own views, that's quite different from a situation in which authority is imposed from above and in which authority seeks to ensure or promote conformity of views. So we are talking about leadership, but we are talking about different patterns of leadership and likewise different patterns of authority. I am not sure who has requested the next
think
opportunity
Stephen.
to speak.
Yes, Stephen.
If it is Stephen, then I indeed yield to him.
Well, I agree, Neil, that you are not inducing any kind of conformity among the participants here, but you do have authority and you do implement authority because you are the author. What is the root of the word authority? It is author, and you have authored this document. And so we need to respond in the context of this document that you have authored. My personal take on this document is that it is very, I won't use the word biased, but it's certainly tendentious. It certainly has an agenda, and we need to respond to that agenda, or at least I feel I do. So there is authority here. Even though you don't impose conformity of response, you do impose some form of structure and tendency based on the contents of your document. I will also disagree with Marvin. I think this is remarkable, but I disagree with Marvin when he kind of goes along with the idea that anything from the past is dead and is a constriction, and anything from in the future, going into the future, is freeing and more spiritual. The reason that the angels of the churches exist is to preserve everything that is spiritually fragrant and alive from the past. And that's why symbols and slogans and any kind of symbolic activity have their roots in the past. If they didn't have their roots in the past, they would not have any kind of relevance or validity for the present or the future. So to make this dichotomy between past is bad and future is good, or past is regression and future is progression, is a very false dichotomy and a dangerous way to think, I think.
Thank you. I believe there are nuances of difference here that I respect. And again, we will continue to operate under the premise of pluralism and diversity. I think that's entirely healthy. Bob, I would like to ask you to examine just two words from the final sentence, namely the words progressive revelation. How do you interpret the word revelation in that short phrase, progressive revelation? Is that words, or is that some form of interpersonal experience?
I think it's both. When Jesus knew that Thomas said that, you are the living Son of God, he said, okay, that's your own individual revelation, which we all have. We gain spiritual insight, and the thought of Justin reveals us those psychic cosmic circle movement things that we need to do to be able to understand more and more of the Father Infinite. So I see progressive, based on your question. I was going to talk about one other quick thing about leadership. Progressive revelation occurs both ways. We've seen at least from Adam and Eve to Melchizedek to Jesus to the fifth epical revelation, and certainly the words that are in the Urantia book clearly put cosmic perspective upon Jesus's revelation. The Spirit of Truth, as I had said just a few minutes ago, I think is inherent in the Spirit of Truth to progress the revelation and to restate Jesus's gospel in current vernacular and in current paradigms. So critical terms, and revelation occurs either as a dispensation, or it occurs as individual revelation. One quick thing about leadership, because this seems to be a theme, and I think that I'm detecting that this idea is kind of a construct from institutional to personal religion. And I do agree with Marvin. I thought you said something interesting that I hadn't thought about, and that was a leader moves a group from the past into the future. I'm paraphrasing what you said. You said it much more eloquently than that. but I've studied leadership quite a bit in the last 20, 25 years or so. I've got at least 2 or 3 dozen books on my shelves that talk about leadership. The paradigm is moving forward. There is no question that this idea of leadership is all about how the structure of an organization will be able to be led, because it's got to be able to be led to go forward. Ilya Goldrak's, the theory of constraints makes me think of buffaloes and geese. Buffaloes were kind of, they had the one manager, the one leader, and it was easy to move a herd of buffalo and kill them, which is why they almost became extinct, was because they really never had a dynamic organization. But geese, you see geese fly, and they take turns leading the flight path. So there's a lot to learn, even from those sorts of things in the environment, to say the least. So just that was my last comment I wanted to make, and I think it's a great topic to talk about.
Thank you. I'm finally going to yield to a temptation that has afflicted me for the past half an hour or so, that relates to science fiction. And the temptation has to do with the fact that when the alien lands upon the Earth, the first thing he is reported to say is, "Take me to your leader." So here we are, and the concept there of "take me to your leader," I think, intrinsically involves authority, because the alien believes that the leader is the person who has the authority to do something, or at least to arrange things that are to the alien's benefit. And that is not the concept of leadership that Marvin has been advocating, but I must say it is part of the popular conception of leadership. And Bob's points about how leadership and the popular conception of leadership are evolving are valid points. And so we can relate that to the fact that there has been an entanglement of leadership with authority and the insistence on conformity of belief. These elements are entangled, frankly, in the history of religion in the Western world. And my concept that I'm putting forward to you is not to say that we can do away with leadership, but that we have to purify it in some ways, so that leadership is not entangled with the authority to insist on particular views. And indeed, that's essentially what the Melchizedek said. There is great hope for any church that worships the living God, validates the brotherhood of man, and dares to remove all creedal pressure from its members. The Melchizedek has not said, do away with the church or the social format. He said there is great hope if the church removes creedal pressure. So I would like now to turn to another element.
Neil?
Yes, I'm going to yield to you immediately, but let me give you a lead in, Doreen, and that has to do with it is the first sentence in the second paragraph, the actual experience of that living faith, which is able to grasp the reality of God and all that relates to the divine spirit of the Father. Now, please say whatever you have in mind, but if you could also talk about this phrase, the actual experience of that living faith, I would be obliged.
Thank you very much. I thought you forgot about me, but
no, I haven't forgotten about you. Although I have had a contention among the males who are on the panel with you for recognition, I guess, at least recognition in my role as the moderator.
Yes, I wasn't interested in leadership, and that to me had nothing to do with the personal religion of what we're discussing. Anyway, gosh, I could almost go into many directions. But first of all, to just relay to you the point that maybe was the question you asked everyone before. And of course, the personal religion, the nature of that is amazing. But like anyone else, or not like anyone else here, I had the insight first. I had the intuition first. I had the relationship first. I had extraordinary experiences first before I had the understanding of what I was experiencing. And so when I found the Arancha book, that really opened me up to another dimension of wow, this is what it is. So I came backwards, and probably I am backwards, and that's how my life has been different, and it's okay. It is what it is. Now, the purpose of the personal relationship that grows you and transforms you, I am an animal. And I recognized all along the way that it was revealed to me, my shortcomings, my defaults, all the problems that how can I grow to be, as I think it was Bob talked about, the superconscious level of reality. And that's where I was heading. And that's where I was most comfortable in. And that's what opened up to me very early on, I would say maybe in my 20s. And not knowing what it was, but definitely having these experiences and the transforming an animal self that's, that I guess, so much and so hard to reveal. But, to eradicate those things in me, the mark of the beast, the selfishness, the lack of forgiveness, humility, all these things that I needed to grow. I needed to find out what is really being a God conscious person. What is God like? And that revealed to me and led me step by step into the direction of the personal experience with God. And it was extraordinary. And I've had numerous experiences, which there's no time I could tell you many stories, but there is nothing like it. And the book talks about it immensely, and Jesus talks about it, but you can't take people from, being a primitive animal self and all of a sudden transform them. It is growth, and growth is slow, and it doesn't happen spontaneously like the suddenlies that the book could talk about. No, that wasn't my experience at all. It was total test through the fires or whatever, and humility and challenges and difficulties, but little by little, the Spirit was leading me. And I didn't trust it at first because I had to have a trust relationship. I didn't trust anyone. I would never trust a leader who told me they're a leader. Are you kidding me? I have to see the actions of what takes place in your own life to me to respect you and regard you and trust you. Well, that's what happened with the Spirit. I began with this trust relationship and challenged the Spirit many, many times. And every time, maybe it took a year, maybe 2 years, or maybe instantly. Maybe things happened because it was necessary for it to happen, but it happened. And that's how I built the trust relationship. And I read, like Marvin and many others, I read so many different religions, the Buddhists, and all the other, not Christianity, but all the other non-traditional religions, and I had to see if it was real. It never, I never trusted what I read until I could experience it myself. And when I experienced it, that was my driving force. So when you talk about what is the personal relationship, it's the driving force of the Spirit. And that was probably the pattern that my thought adjuster had in store for me. So that was amazing. Now, understanding, intellectualizing how you all do that, my goodness, that was really challenging, because when I found the Arancha book, it's like, oh my God, this is what it means. This is where I'm going. This is why we're living. There's reason for everything, and the reasoning came after the experiences. And I think that the journey for each of us is so different and unique for, because of the Spirit is unique in each of us. even though the spirit, they say the spirit is the same, but our personalities are unique. So how do you connect with an absolute, an absolute being, a deity? How do you connect with the spirit? By the desire and the hunger, and to become, and to ask and give yourself, give your personal self to a divine being who I guess knows how to take you where you have to go. But the realization absolutely came decades later. The experiences first. I'll stop.
Well, thank you. I would like to react to something you said earlier in this set of your remarks, that you called yourself an animal. Well, I guess in a technical sense you are, as are all of us, but I assure you that we certainly do not consider you to be animalistic. That's an interesting adjective. It implies, shall we say, the lower range of animal behavior. But we have a situation, we, all of us, of being animal beings with a spirit nucleus residing in our minds. Marvin stated at one point last week that we have great difficulty in interpreting the spiritual leadings of this fragment of God the Father who is living within us. But in effect, those spiritual leadings are part of the efforts to help us rise above, shall we say, purely animalistic tendencies. And of course, that is the point of this evolutionary process that you have developed. I'm sorry, that you have described. Marvin, you would like to add?
Oh, just a moment of levity regarding the animal nature we all share. What did the Zen students, a Zen student went to see the Zen master and says, "Master, I have an important question." And the master says, "Well, speak." He says, "Well, can a dog have cosmic consciousness?" And the Zen master paused for a long time and looked profoundly at the student and said, "Woof."
All right. I
couldn't resist, on the theme of animal nature. There's the dog in each of us, I guess, huh?
I suppose. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, we've had an extremely interesting discussion of the two paragraphs from Jesus' second discourse on religion that appear at the bottom of page 1 of my essay. I will now take the amazing step of asking you to turn the page and to proceed to the top of page 2. And specifically, I'm going to do this paragraph by paragraph. I think that's going to happen most of the time as we are proceeding through this material. Bob, would you do us the favor of reading the first paragraph at the top of page 2?
Sure, I will, Neil. The supernal experience of finding God cannot be compressed, condensed, or confined so as to fit within the covers of a book, nor be delimited by the intellectual adaptations required to read and understand it. Our experience of finding God can and must be personal, mindful, and spiritual, and we should remain intensely aware that God is not just an infinite being who resides on distant paradise, but also an active presence who pervades and animates all reality, whether material, mindful, or spiritual, as well as all intelligent beings who inhabit our planet Urantia and every other living environment dispersed throughout the grand universe.
Thank you. I'm going to do an effort, at least aimed at turning the tables, as Stephen commented that this material has viewpoints of my own built into it, and of course it does. He also commented that I have certain goals in mind, and he's right about that. But I'm going to now ask for someone else to comment on the meaning of the first sentence, which I will repeat after Bob read it. The supernal experience of finding God cannot be compressed, condensed, or confined so as to fit within the covers of a book, nor be delimited by the intellectual adaptations required to read and understand it. Marvin, would you parse that sentence for me, please?
Well, thank you, Neil. As a matter of fact, I had a comment to make. So it was divine intervention that must have prompted you to call on me.
Well, it was not charismatic, excuse me.
Uh, so I think the thrust of that sentence is that God is infinite, eternal, and knows no boundaries, and the actual living experience of God can't be confined in any way, really. And yet, the Orange Book says to us that inevitably, all of us must function with what they call a frame of reference, a set of parameters within which we think and conceptualize and have our experience. And that frame of reference is constantly being broken and remade in new and higher ways as we progress. That's the nature of growth. Our old prejudices, preconceptions, our frames of reference get outlived, and we have to search for new ones, including this experience of God. And yet at the same time, all of us have the need in the present moment to function with a set of conceptions and a way of understanding what it is we're doing and what we're doing in life and what our purpose is and why we're here. And when I get up in the morning planning my day, I mean, I have to have a sense of who I am, why I'm here, why I go about what I do, and what my life is about.
I thought you would ask Franzel to answer those questions.
Well, I could accept Franzel as my charismatic authority in that regard, but I think Jesus is asking us to search within and install God in that role ultimately. But here's the dilemma. In this section, we're going to read in the far, far future the nature of cultism. The beginning of the last paragraph is, but a cult or a spiritual culture will not function if it is too complex. We need a simple way to internalize what the gospel is, what reality is, and how we live our lives. Otherwise, we get bogged down and we can't really make it function right. So here's the dilemma. I think we have to have an understanding of what Jesus was suggesting how we live that is simple enough to keep in our consciousness all the time, and simple enough to convey to others when we share spiritual truth, as we hope we can do in ministry, right? Because Jesus asked us to do these things. So the dilemma then is to have a kernel, a core set, a symbolic sense of understanding what we're about, what our lives are about, that is workable, that is simple enough to be workable day in and day out, and yet allows for unlimited growth and expansion. That's the trick. That's the art form of living, I think. And for me, that conception is a way of life in the family of God. It's a way of understanding myself in relation to my source as my spiritual parent, and all of us as sisters and brothers commonly engaged in this endeavor of living in spiritual family. I can hold on to that. And at the same time, that conception that I'm in the midst of a living spiritual unfoldment of family relationships spiritually allows me to do what that first sentence describes, which is create unendingly, proliferate, grow, try this, try that, do something new every moment while keeping my life stable. And I think it's not a small trick. It's not a small endeavor to find that which stabilizes our lives, grounds us in spiritual process, and we can hold it steadily, but allows us to really grow endlessly. And that's the walking of the line that I think we're looking for. Just my 2 cents.
Well, I would certainly oblige you by comparing it with at least a nickel or maybe a quarter, not just 2 cents, Marvin. I'm going to have to be even more direct in the way that I put this question. And so now I will specifically ask, how does reading the Urantia book compare with the supernal experience of finding God? Stephen, could you take that?
Well, at least for me, the Urantia book was a scaffold, I would say, or part of the scaffold. My experience was learning about Christ in the Urantia book and learning about Jesus in Christianity simultaneously. So my conversion experience was actually a dual phenomenon that traced to my Christian influences and my Urantia book influences. So I have a very close association between the two. I'm sorry, Neil, what was the exact question?
Well, let me come up with approximately the question. I did not memorize the word, so I will try it. I think what you have said is that reading the Urantia book functioned for you as part of your search for God, and therefore as part of the supernal experience of finding God, but that reading the Urantia book was not the sum and substance, not the totality of your experience of finding God.
Yeah. So I don't know if I've told this story. This summer of 1971, and I was just about done reading the Urantia book, and I was in the middle of reading Confessions of St. Augustine, and I actually had a spiritual experience on the subway of New York subway, and that for me kind of coalesced my intellectual efforts, and it kind of gave me a feeling of reality to it that was beyond my own mind, even beyond my own feelings. It was the only experience I ever had that was did not really involve feelings or conceptions. It was really beyond feelings and conceptions. But of course, in terms of language, you have to talk about it conceptually or in terms of how it felt. But it really did feel like it did come from outside of myself. And that's the only interior experience I've ever had that felt that way. So I'm sure my education from the Urantia book had a lot to do with that, where I really had a firm basis for conceptual belief, but also my experience reading the Confessions had a very, very strong emotional part of that, or support of that, where I was really able to feel the, or at least empathize with the incredibly powerful connection that one can have with God, and how real that was for Augustine, and therefore how real it could be for anybody. And so there's two ways of experiencing the reality of God. One is I'd say more human in terms of Augustine's writing, and the other was, well, I guess you'd have to say revelatory in terms of the Urantia book. So for me, that was a pretty powerful combination, pretty powerful 1-2 punch. I got the human and the divine intermingled and complementing one another and reinforcing one another. So I guess that's my best answer.
Thank you. I think that was a very interesting and indeed profound answer. I would now turn to Bob and ask him to explain his view of the relationship between reading the Urantia book and the supernal experience of finding God. And in doing that, please comment on whether the supernal experience of finding God is conditioned, whether it depends on reading the Urantia book.
Well, the last half of your question there, the only way that I guess we can explain this and to respond to your questions is to take it into a personal role here. And, the last part of your question is, of course not. The Urantia book, I think either Stephen or Marvin used the word scaffolding. And I would like to use that word myself, because For my own personal experience, I don't think I've ever had a supernal experience of finding God. I never knew that he didn't exist. For some reason, I've just always felt that if I look back on it and I try to define what finding God means, and we haven't done that yet. That's a process. Finding God is a process. And of course, the papers tell us, at least in 3 different places, that that the desire to find God means that God has already found you. Well, he doesn't need to find us, but I think it's that reciprocal movement. He's got the 2 direct sources, the personality and the thought adjuster, by which he knows what's in our hearts, what our status is, and where we are. So it may be somewhat of an oxymoron that God has to find us, but I think what the revelators of Jesus, all 3 of those came from Jesus, means that it's reciprocal. As soon as God knows that I've had the desire, he's already found me, of course, and now I've decided to go on this finding God trek, meaning I need to know more and more about the infinite. And I think that's my supernal experience. It's I needed something, as Doreen said so eloquently, that this aspect of finding took a larger piece of scaffolding on this little building that I already had, and it was going to make it much bigger. Going to move it out horizontally and vertically, and I think that's what the Urantia papers have done for me. That and of course, no, they can't be compressed or condensed or confined. They start this scaffolding, and then spiritual insight then takes over. And spiritual insight probably has already taken over, which is why the Urantia papers resonate, so solidly with many of us. Hope I answered that closely. Anyway, over.
You certainly addressed the essence of my question, and obviously in posing the question to you and the others, I was not trying to dictate the manner of your reply, but your reply definitely falls within the general field of reference to which I was appealing. I would like to give a variant of the question to Doreen. And in asking her this variation on the question, I believe I know what she will answer. But nevertheless, I want to put the question in a very direct way. Can someone who does not read the Urantia book have the supernal experience of finding God?
Well, obviously, of course, there is, he's available, however, to everyone in his entire universe and creation. Of course, that's his love, for us to find him. So it's the sincere desire to know God and to love him. That is, to me, the direction. It's the arrow is pointing in this way. Find me. He has an insatiable appetite for love, and he wants all his creation to find him, to love him as he loves us. So, we talk about how do you find him? It's the continual conversation. It is not an interrupt. Jesus had a continual conversation, whether it was in meditation, whether it was in so many different avenues that you could take to have and set up this relationship with God. It's there for the taking. It's there for the asking. Well, the continuation that I experienced, it was the search that led me to discover an inner world that was so illuminating and adventurous. The thoughts, the insights, the ideas, the inner knowing, it was revealed. It was revealed to me, and I always can feel the presence of God. Didn't know what it was. I thought it was angels or whatever. I didn't know until, of course, the Urantia book. So after I found the Urantia book, like I said, it gave me so much meaning to the experiences. but that it was so extraordinary because I knew I could feel in my meditations, and it was so powerful sometimes that that connection, the circuits are very strong. And once you open up that doorway, and the desire definitely, has to begin with God, who are you? Tell me about yourself. And that's how my doorway opened. And it took me, I think I once told you, almost a year to find the harmony within myself that allowed me, mind, body, and spirit, to synchronize, to be receptive to the spirit. And before that, I tried everything and it didn't work. So you have, each individual, how you commune with God is up to you. You could find him in nature, you could find him anywhere, but it has to be in the silent receptivity where you could feel the presence, you could hear. Well, I can't say hear. I was never a person could hear, but I was able to see. He opened up my sight and I could see things way ahead before they ever happened. And I wasn't sure what he was showing me. And then when things, after years of having certain experiences, and call them mystical experiences, it doesn't matter. I didn't become a fanatic. I didn't tell anybody. It just cemented the idea that he is so real in my life that he wants me to succeed, and he won't let me fail, and I'm not alone. And this security, it helped me to grow as a human being and transform every part. And yes, I say the animal self because that lower level of defensiveness and and how we are with our habits, it disappeared. And that was, to me, how the transformation in the soul began. It disappeared little by little, and I could no longer look at people the same way. I could no longer, I said, what, you treat people in an indignant way. And it was like an understanding in your soul. It really was, I'm talking about decades of growth and transforming that inner self that needed to learn new, loving, I guess, spiritual habits that God has waited probably for all my life to give me and to help me to find him. And I did, and I did, and I did. And there's nothing, I could talk forever about it and the experiences that he gave me, but he revealed so much to me that helped me to live and saved my life. And I know other people had the same experiences. I do, it's when, I hate to say all the time, what happens when there's an attraction? It's light from some people that are attracted to like-minded people. And people then open up to you for reasons that maybe they trust you and they could share their experience with you. And I said in the Urantia movement, everybody was very intellectual. And I felt like I was left out, but it was okay. I needed to find meaning intellectually as well. And that is why I'm with your program, because that forces me to learn and to grow in that level. And of course, it's twofold, both inner and outer world. But when people have told me their stories, mine is nothing in comparison. Extraordinary things, how God saves people's lives, how the spirit moves inside of them and opens up a vast reality that they're totally converted. And I don't mean any traditional way. I mean in God consciousness, and live a full, extraordinary life that ordinarily wouldn't have happened. So I know my 5 minutes are up. And I will stop.
Well, I understand what you have just said at the very end there. I think if I could be allowed to draw a conclusion, not only from what you just said, but from the stories that you've told about your experience in other contributions today and during previous webinars, it seems to be obvious that your supernal experience of finding God began well before you found the Urantia book. And on the other hand, from what you've said, finding the Urantia book helped you continue that experience and perhaps also enhanced it. Do I understand you correctly?
Yes.
Okay, good. I have a request from Marvin.
Just a couple of thoughts, Neil. One, by the way, I've just been enjoying everyone's sharing. It's very rich. You asked the question, can someone, let's see, can someone find a living relationship with God without the Urantia book? Which was kind of a cute, provocative question. And the thought that occurred to me soon afterwards was to sort of reverse the question, and that is, can someone have the Urantia book and not have discovered a living relationship with God? And my experience is that there are plenty of people who actually fall into that category, who have sometimes a very sophisticated intellectual understanding and pursuit or involvement with the material in the Urantia book, but will themselves express that they don't really have much of a connection with God, and it's a mystery to them. So I think that's another variation on the theme, is you have almost the religion of authority or of the mind in relation to the Urantia book, and not much more beyond it.
Marvin, I appreciate what you've just said. I was inclined to pose to you the specific phrase intellectual adaptations, and I think you've already commented on that intellectual adaptations to understand the ideas in the Urantia book as an intellectual matter are in themselves not the supernal experience of finding God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so that's one observation, and it's quite related to what you just shared, Neil. I would be very much in agreement with you. They're not identical at all. And then I wanted to share, Doreen has been gracious in sharing much of her history. And I also sort of share a little bit about my personal history in this whole yearning and search part of life. And my experience was that the spiritual search came before I found the Urantia book. And I wouldn't say I would call it the search for God. How I would describe it is this raw yearning to understand. The way I guess I conceptualized it before I ever ran into the Urantia book is, what's going on here? What is the bigger picture? What am I part of? What is happening in reality and in the universe? I had, as a late adolescent, an intense need to have answers to that set of questions. What's the big picture? Why am I here? What's the purpose of existence? All of those fundamental questions in the generic sense. And I think they're profoundly religious questions that just they weren't doctrinally couched. I was feeling those needs for answers to those questions intensely for many, many months, in a year or a year and a half. And I had gone searching in many different spots, in Eastern religions and yoga and mystical traditions of various kinds, and was finding bits and pieces, but certainly nothing that really said to me, yes, you really have this now. You've got real comprehensive, clear answers to your questions. And it wasn't until I found the Urantia book. And I had no idea. I had a profound sense when I first encountered it, that this will answer all of your questions. Of course, I didn't have the answers. I had to then read the text. And it wasn't until 3-4 months of steady reading that I began to get a sense of answers to that level of question. And what I learned in those early encounters with the text was that the venture that we're engaged in is huge. It's cosmological. It's the entirety of reality. And that this text I had was a major revelation. But the key thing I got from it, beyond those intellectual realizations and the intellectual process of getting all of this information, is that I had an opportunity. I had an opportunity to actually get into a personal, intimate connection with deity, the God that made me. And that's why I existed, is to be in that relationship and to have it impact and affect the way I lived. And that came in the early understandings in reading the Urantia book. And so for me, it's been this leapfrog experience. The initial experience was one of yearning and questioning. Then came intellectual understanding, which if it stopped there would have been insufficient. Out of that intellectual understanding came a much further yearning for intimate relationship with what I was coming to understand with my mind, who God was. And then I had to actually get into that relationship, which means moving well beyond any text and getting into living relationship and experience with another person, the presence of God inside of me. And then began all kinds of new challenges and leapfrogging, taking another leap, which was, okay, now I have this relationship, I have this text, I have answers to all my questions, I have the relationship. What am I supposed to be doing in response, in return, to give back what I've been given? And then began another iteration of intellectual understanding, moving to experiential endeavor in service and work, and trying to live my life according to these values and ideals. So there's this constant back and forth between intellectual new information and working to live it out in one's life and do something practical and experiential with it, that I think is part of this. If you're a dynamic living religionist, there's always this back and forth between new understandings and then the ideals, and then attempting to live them out. And then again, there are new ideals that come as a result. And I think that process is a never-ending process. I think it's designed to be an eternal unfolding of new realizations, new challenges, and living them out, and then again, new challenges again. So,
thank you for sharing that. It's very interesting. Of course, I agree with you that the experience of each person is diverse in terms of the range of possibilities. And frankly, that there is no single pattern that is obligatory for human beings in general. The possibilities of different levels of adaptation are open to all of us, and intellectual adaptations are not the whole answer. That was part of the reason that I put the question to you. Stephen, I would like to turn to the second sentence in that paragraph at the top of page A2. And before I proceed to reread it myself, I will then give you the opportunity to comment on that sentence as you see fit. So just be aware that when I finish reading, it will be your turn to speak. The sentence reads as follows: our experience of finding God can and must be personal, mindal, and spiritual. And we should remain intensely aware that God is not just an infinite being who resides on distant paradise, but also an active presence who pervades and animates all reality, whether material, mindal, or spiritual, as well as all intelligent beings who inhabit our planet Urantia and every other living environment dispersed throughout the grand universe. Over to you, Stephen.
I think one thing that this says is that God cannot be appreciated or related to as an intellectual exercise. If that's the extent of your relationship, you're missing the boat. It's got to be experientially realized as well as intellectually realized. In fact, it can be experientially realized without being intellectually realized. There are many, many spiritually fragrant people who have little or no cognitive understanding or articulation of what God is in their life. You know what? It doesn't matter a whit if that reality is expressed in their daily life as how they relate to other people. So God is real first, and second and third, and God is an idea, well, maybe 25th. And that's the reality of it. It's on all levels. Mindel is one of them, but I think that religion, at least in the West, has in certain contexts focused on the mindel at the expense of the spiritual, and even some religions have focused on the material at the expense of the mindel and the spiritual. So I think spirituality is experiential in nature, and it does not necessarily need cognitive appreciation or intellectual articulation.
Thank you, Bob. I'm going to give you the same question that I posed to Stephen, just to give your comments on the sentence and what it implies.
Neil, could you point me to the sentence one more time?
Yes, all right. It's the second sentence in the paragraph at the top of page 2. Do you want me to reread it?
Yeah, please do that again.
Our experience of finding God can and must be personal, mindal, and spiritual. And we should remain intensely aware that God is not just an infinite being who resides on distant paradise, but also an active presence who pervades and animates all reality, whether material, mindal, or spiritual, as well as all intelligent beings who inhabit our planet Urantia and every other living environment dispersed throughout the grand universe.
Yes, that's a profound sentence. And the way I see that, I would agree with all of that in there. That let me go back to something that we had said earlier, and that I had reinforced, that this idea of the Urantia book putting a scaffolding up, of which I can then, through experience, through matter, mind, and spiritual experiences, wrap my personality around it, and then put some real value to it, so that I can start to build the walls and floors. So I see this as a real scaffolding, that I'm out there doing these sorts of things as I start to understand more and more about the Father Infinite, about the philosophical concept of the I Am. Just to point to the point here that you made was that he's not just an infinite being, but an active presence who pervades and animates all reality. Well, the first thing I think about when I saw that was the 7 absolutes of infinity. That came a little later in study. I studied the story of Adam and Eve. I was real concerned about Marvin had. I had similar questions to the ones Marvin had, and I needed to start to put the scaffolding up to figure out how to solve that one there. And I went right to that. I needed to know who Adam and Eve was and what they did, and that put a pin in the center of the target, and then I could then build around that. But I think once I finally got to understanding the paper 118, which is more like our Genesis, where it explains how the first source and center had to differentiate, and he differentiated into these 7 absolutes of infinity, from which we then get the triunities and the triodities, and then power, personality, and God, the sevenfold. That's very intellectual and complicated things to be able to understand. And over time, some of the walls and the floors have gone up, so that when I finally got to the God, the Supreme, and the Supreme Being, I could understand that, okay, now, God has to have, the Father Infinite, the I Am has to have a finite aspect by which I can begin to even understand it. And as they say, we'll find God. We will attain God in paradise before we will actually find the Supreme. We won't find the supreme until all personalities have reached light and life. So it's about personality. And I state again that it's a personality, it's a personal universe, it's a personality-driven universe. Back over to you, Neil.
Thank you, Bob. I would comment that your use of the metaphor of a scaffold as something that you want to build on is interesting. I would compare it with the historical reality of the French Revolution, when the phrase mounting the scaffold meant that someone was climbing the steps up to a close encounter with Madame the Guillotine. But I'm sure that that was not the kind of scaffold that you had in mind.
Not quite. No, thank you.
All right. So I would offer Doreen the possibility of commenting on this sentence in the same way or in a different way.
Oh, I really didn't respond to that sentence. If you want to put it a different way, go ahead. It didn't resonate within me.
Well, the point, I think, to be very specific, has to do with the fact that God is an active presence throughout the world, throughout the entire universe. And he is in every human being, every intelligent being in our entire grand universe also.
Thank you.
Do you agree with that? Do you want to comment on that?
Oh, sure. I can comment and say, of course, we're told that the power of the spirit is over mind and matter, and mind is over matter. So therefore, there is a real physical energy, a quantity that we're responsive to. That's the gravity force, the spiritual values and spiritual forces. They're more real. And it's interesting because I was reading some things and I thought, wow, how God works so amazingly with the other spirit realities, and in creating not only our soul, but how even when I read Plato and it said, this is really the shadow of the real. This is not reality. So it always stuck in my mind. And that to me said, yeah, of course. We only see it from such a point of view that's so shallow and limited. Anyway, but the circuits, I love this spiritual circuits that says that spiritual gravity literally pulls the soul of man paradiseward. And so I'll just give you a couple of things that I found and I thought it was more interesting. So that, I read the composer Johannes Brahms. He said sometimes he'd receive music from divine inspiration. He said, immediately I feel vibrations that thrill my whole being, spirit illuminating the soul power within. And I realize at such moments the significance of Jesus's revelation. I and my Father are one. And he says, measure by measure, his finished product is revealed to him. So it's like, what can I say? That it's the quality that it brings, the value of our significance of our life, what is revealed to each of us and why. So it comes in many different forms, mindful, material, spiritual. It all works together. It's not separate. The idea is to harmonize it, to unify it all. So then reality becomes more significant in our lives and we're able to function on a higher level. And that higher level is, of course, the service, the reality, the recognition of the needs of other human beings. And whether it's through music or art or any other way. Actually, there was one more thing that I had read, and I wish I could remember it exactly, the person's name, but it was somebody that developed, I think, the DNA, a process to recognize DNA in a more efficient manner. And he said he was driving his car, and all of a sudden, it's that total focus on something that you want revealed. And I always thought if God wants it revealed, and it would come through different people at different times, he said the whole process would reveal why he's driving his car. And that is how he came, to, I think he won some kind of Nobel Prize. But it was extraordinary to me how they know how to get through to us, and not to us, but to everyone. And when they do, it's not only for my benefit, and that I did come to recognize, because whatever benefits me, really, it benefits others. And God doesn't just say, well, we want you, you're special. I never felt that way. I felt my responsibility is to understand those decisions that I make as a result of the influence of the power of the Spirit is going to affect everyone else. And everyone else affects everyone else. And that's how we're all connected. It's not an isolated thing. So therefore, when you talk about all these things, I mean, I could ramble, and I'm sorry if I am, but I just find it so amazing when you read all these different ways, as each of you have contributed to find, or God finding us, or God has found us, and how we respond to that circuitry. And it's never ending. It's wider and growing more and more each day. As Marvin said, there is no limitation. It's no limitation. And I never find him. I'm constantly striving to be better and better and better, because I have to really grow and change. I didn't like myself always. And I'm more of a happier person today. I really am a happier person as a result of that infiltration of the power of, the Spirit, of the thought controller at this point. Anyway. So be it.
Thank you, Doreen. I am looking at the clock and believe we just have a few minutes left. It would not be possible to discuss the entirety of the second paragraph at the top of page 2, but I propose at least to open discussion of the first sentence in that paragraph, and I will now read that first sentence. As we cooperate with and seek to inspire numerous other human beings, we are also seeking to enhance and cooperate with God's presence within them, as well as his plans for their destiny and the destiny of our tumultuous and troubled planet, Urantia. Now, Marvin, I'm giving you a crystal clear opportunity to talk about leadership, but in any case, please comment on this first sentence. Marvin, you're muted. I'm sorry.
Thanks, Neil. If you don't mind, allow me to maybe read the sentence again.
Go ahead.
Just shared, yeah. Because it's your thinking is sophisticated, and it sometimes takes me more than an initial exposure to get down to what you're trying to communicate. As we cooperate with and seek to inspire numerous other human beings, we are also seeking to enhance and cooperate with God's presence within them, as well as his plans for their destiny and the destiny of our tumultuous and troubled planet Urantia. What occurs to me, Neil, is relatively early on in my history of involvement with the Urantia book, meaning probably 10, 15, 20 years into it, because I've been with it about 50 years now. The questions that began to really burn in my heart and soul really related to this second sentence. And really related, I think this is true for any of us who've been reading the book for a while, really began to relate to my relationship with the Supreme. What is it that we can contribute? What can we give to the larger picture to help this whole situation move forward in keeping with the purposes of the Father and with Jesus and our spiritual benefactors? What contribution can we make? And that becomes, I think, a burning issue for many of us. How do I contribute? How do I give back? And how do I do so, given that I am now a partaker of this remarkable revelation, sitting at this moment in time in our history, in our culture? What can I do to make a contribution toward the unfolding of the Supreme, the accomplishment of destinies? And I think that becomes an inevitable part of this living relationship with God. the sense of duty, of loyalty to the welfare of the larger whole, that we are part of. Now that I'm well established in it and lodged, and I have connection and nurture and nourishment in my relationship with God, what is my responsibility to my sisters and brothers who are famishing around me, who are dying, literally dying on the vine for lack of spiritual nourishment? I mean, people are committing suicide because they're so desperate and so lonely and so isolated and so unaware of why they've been created and who they are. So to me, this second question really relates profoundly to a sense of duty. And, as Jesus said it so eloquently, how do I, as he put it, give the milk of truth to those who are babes in spiritual perception? And how do I take the precepts of this incredibly complex text, this revelation, and so understand them and hold them in my own mind and my own heart that I can effectively reach out to the person I meet on the street who has no familiarity with these big concepts and share with them the milk of truth that they need in that moment to find some sense of solace and stability and meaning in their lives. That, for me, becomes a driving set of challenges. And that's what flows for me from this second sentence. How do we give back in a way that is meaningful to the people around us and to the culture, the larger culture that we are part of? And again, for me, the best way for me to understand that is to conceptualize it is that I am in the midst of living a way of life and spiritual family. And if I can find that nurturing relationship with God, where I'm sustained and I'm loved, I can feel the love, then it becomes incumbent on me to find ways to share that possibility with as many people as I encounter in a way that they can understand it. That's what flows as a responsibility from reading this text, I think.
Thank you, Stephen. I will offer you just a slight variation on the question that I asked to Marvin. It seems to me that, in effect, this sentence at the beginning of the second paragraph calls us to refrain from looking at salvation, looking at spiritual engagement solely for our own purposes, to immerse ourselves in the welfare of other human beings as well, and for that matter, God's plans for our planet, to the degree that we can. If you don't agree with that, then please feel free to react however you wish.
Well, I do agree with that. The reality of our spiritual gift and our spiritual relationship with God only exists in our expression of it. It does not exist outside of our expression of it, which is one reason I felt that finding God for oneself was an inopportune way of expressing our relationship with the Father. We're always finding God for and in and as the other. If there is no, sorry about this phone, if there is no relationship with the other, there's no way of finding God for oneself. So I just took exception to that form of expression. I mean, obviously I know what you were getting at. I just don't think that in terms of communication and appropriate signification, it was the best way you could have gone about saying that. Anyway, our love for God only exists in our expression for of that love with others.
Thank you. Doreen, would you follow, either commenting on what you perceive or perhaps on something that one of the others has already expressed?
Oh, my goodness. I think Marvin took the words right out of my mouth. It's exactly what I was going to say. It was funny, but it's not funny. It's the seraphim I know have always guided me, or people to me. There isn't a day, I would say, when I'm outdoors that I don't find someone to drop a seed with. And it just happens. I don't know why it happens. And it just happened yesterday, and I just went out, but for a little while. But anyway, I would say through sharing God, with others, it really is profound that it opens up a sense of knowing there is a course that people could take. There is, you call it salvation or whatever, but it's survival. And that survival is so needed for young people today. And I was going to say, this week I had I heard of three people, 21 to 25, that overdosed and died. And that's just one person. It's thousands and thousands in this country alone. And why do you commit suicide, and you're so young? What hope in our society do we provide for them? We're really missing the mark, totally. Everywhere people are angry and they're full of hate and division. And if only they knew the love that God has for us, the profound peace and beauty within us and around us. If only we could share that. And I try to share it in a different way with each person that's receptive to listening, because they're hungry. You're right. They're starving. They're starving out there, and the message is not healthy. It's unhealthy. And where is the beauty around us? Where is the kindness? What is society telling them that they have to withdraw from it? That they cannot be led by anything but external messages. And it's so detrimental. Like I said, I found a young girl yesterday. She talked to me for an hour and a half, a total stranger. Of course, it's easier sometimes to talk to strangers. I never will see her again, I'm sure. And so they could share their life, their inner life. And, it gives you an opportunity to respond as a grandmother, say, to that young woman. I've lived most of my life, and I could tell, here, I survived. You could survive too. And all the adversity is helpful to survival. So yes, I think we have a lot in our hand, a lot of knowledge, and a lot of work to do. Never ending, and let it be directed by whatever forces out there, whether it's the seraphim, the spirit of truth, it doesn't matter. It's out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. In order to give you the opportunity to conclude this discussion today, I think it would be useful for me to reread the sentence, and that will give you a clearer target on which you can comment. The sentence reads as follows: as we cooperate with and seek to inspire numerous other human beings, we are also seeking to enhance and cooperate with God's presence within them, as well as his plans for their destiny and the destiny of our tumultuous and troubled planet, Urantia. Over to you.
Okay, so, again, another profound sentence. And I think that what you've done with this sentence is make it active tense and not passive tense. And I'm going to focus on the first phrase inside the commas there. We are also seeking to enhance and cooperate with God's presence within them. When I first read it, I thought, if I wrote that, I'd probably say we should seek to enhance and cooperate with God's presence within them. So I appreciate the active tense here. That particular phrase right there is one that kind of resonated as I was reading it, thinking that, and going back to this idea of scaffolding, understanding the thought adjuster in the ways that the revelators can have described it. They really can't define personality, but they tell us a lot about how the thought adjuster operates. That particular phrase makes me think about the term namaste. My spirit inside of me talks to the spirit inside of you. Cosmic intuitions: discover, recognize, interpret, and choose. Think of when Jesus met, I think it was Mark, who was he was the lad that was despondent, and he was on the mountain. And Jesus humbled himself enough to uplift the boy to to go through that whole idea about that, he's a strong human being. He should be able to withstand the vicissitudes of life, and he turned the boy around. The way that Bill Sadler Jr. used to explain it, he said, this is the boss's kids. Anytime you run into somebody, how would you treat the boss's kids if you got, if in fact you were at the boss's house and, you were at dinner? You should treat everyone as they're the boss's kids. So my thinking is with the story of Jesus, I think what we're trying to get here is understanding this new, improved understanding of God's plans and how thought adjusters operate. We can and should be dealing and thinking, conceptualizing that an individual is the boss's kids. They have a thought adjuster on this planet. Every human being of normal mind has a thought adjuster that's working to spiritize their thinking. So this thinking of discover, recognize, interpret, and choose ought to be supplemented, ought to be something that we should think about on an everyday basis. And then the values of, the basic supernal values such as loyalty, integrity, willing to lead, help people develop the fruits of the Spirit that will ultimately lead them into being an altruistic individual, and then spread that one, light the next candle. So that's what I got out of that, and that was the phrase that kind of stuck with me as I read through it. Thanks, Neil.
Thank you, Bob. I must share with all of you my realization that I am now heading toward the supernal experience of writing the report. And I am wondering how I'm going to manage that, because all of you have been profound, and the ideas that you have shared with me and with our viewers are almost going to defy summary, but I shall have to deal with that as best I may. We will pray for you. We will pray for you, Neil. I appreciate your prayers, because it's going to be quite a challenge. In any event, I will mention to all of our viewers now, as I mentioned to each of the participants before we began, that this is the final webinar in phase 4 of our series of webinars on this topic. And we will take a break, probably for about 1 month. And I would expect that Bob and I and others of you whom I may consult will end up selecting some Saturday in the month of October to resume these webinars with the beginning of phase 5. So thank all of you, and thank those of you who are going to watch our program.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you all.
Bye.